Hi, everybody. Thanks for waiting. I'm super excited to get started. Today, we're going to be talking about how to embrace observability in your API layer. Okay. So quick introductions, a little bit about who we are. I'm Saoirse Hinksman. I'm the Digital Content Marketing Manager here at SmartBear for AlertSite. And I have Dennis and John with me if you guys want to introduce yourselves.
Sure. Dennis Goodwin. I am the product owner for AlertSite here at SmartBear.
Hi, John McKinney here. I'm one of the team leads and I cover AlertSite.
Awesome. So obviously today we're going to talk a little bit about what observability is, what the value of it is, and then how you can implement that or adopt that in your culture as an organization. And then obviously we'll be talking a little bit about what we can do to help at SmartBear, and whether, I know that a couple of you are SmartBear customers, so we'll talk a little bit about how to use the tools that you have to really get a culture of observability in your organization so that you can make your release processes and resolution processes a bit more efficient. So, observability. First off, what does it mean? So the technical definition is from control theory is it's a measure of how well internal states of a system can be inferred from the knowledge of its external outputs. But in this case, what it really means is having the ability or aiming to get insights from your production environments or from things that you deploy, and then using that as context so that you can go back and then find and fix issues quickly and efficiently. So really having concrete insight into the behavior of your systems. And so what we're going to talk a little bit about is really how you can test and monitor together to get a better idea of what's going on with your APIs. So what that kind of means is really helping to identify ways that you could fail. And then if you do fail, how can you go back and fix that? And what information do you have at your disposal to use to make that resolution process fast, efficient, and help connect all of your teams so that you can really basically optimize your entire process, right? And make sure that you have full visibility into the health of your APIs. And so obviously we're going to talk a little bit more about why it's important, but I figured it would be a good idea to start and explain with something that's hopefully relatable to all of you. So I'm going to go through an example that hopefully we're familiar with. If you guys are HBO fans, you might have seen this, but there's a show that's out currently. It's in season 2. It's called Westworld. And for those of you that don't know, it is a show that's based around this idea where this company creates these parks. Well, actually, it's a unified park, but you can go to different areas within the parks, like Westworld, Shogun World, the Raj are just some examples. And then when you're there, you are interacting with basically the most realistic, they call them hosts, but they're really sort of like robotic.
Synthetic beings.
Yeah, synthetic beings.
Artificial person.
Yeah, artificial person. So you interact with them in this park, and that's basically your whole experience. And Delos's whole idea is that you can live without limits. And so how this basically relates is you have the hosts on the left, that is a host, and then on the right, that's actually a person just interacting with the host in the park. And so they've programmed these hosts to be as realistic as possible, going through different scenarios, different storylines across a variety of different areas within the park. And so at first, everything is running smoothly. It's going great. It's super awesome, realistic sort of experience. Everyone's sort of wowed by what's going on, which is like, obviously like your ideal scenario when you release a product, right? You want everyone to be borderline too obsessed with it. So they did a really great job at doing that at first. And they, of course, had an ops team with capabilities to monitor exactly what's going on in the park. They had a huge interactive map where they can see what's going on. But as things started to move a little bit faster.
Well, wait, just a question for you. How would they communicate with the hosts possibly out there?
You mean the person or the host can interact with one
another? How
another?
the operations and QA team, how would they interact with the hosts? How would they update them?
Right. That's a great question, John.
So there must be some sort of, I don't know, API, but that API can't be based on SOAP. I mean, that XML body is just far too much information to pass along. Possibly RESTful.
Yeah, possibly. We could say that. I think it's safe to say.
Absolutely. And to keep the guests safe, they probably would have to have some testing.
Oh, absolutely.
To keep the host from harming the guests. And I recall a couple of different things. One being they can't identify objects from outside of the park, right? So if something from the modern world comes into the park, there was some saying they used to basically say they don't see anything. Doesn't look like anything to me. So I guess in some ways they would have to test that.
In theory, right? Like
In
it
theory.
should be how your processes are. But I think as they began to grow a little bit bigger, they had a lot more people in the park. They had a lot more things they were updating and adding and moving fast. Something got away. So they added this update, which you can see on the background of the chalkboard, right? Like trying to understand like how it would work. The intent was really to make their products more realistic and add new enhancements. But as John mentioned
probably
before,
agile.
Yeah, probably agile, probably an agile framework. As John mentioned before, something kind of went awry with the code there. So, you know, one of the hosts looks at this picture and is obviously having a really hard time understanding what's going on. He's freaking out because he can actually see what's in the picture, and it's kind of messing up with all of the rest of his code. But Dolores on the right looks at it and says, it doesn't look like anything to me.
Where it means her API is working perfectly.
In theory.
So the other guy's not supposed to see anything.
Yeah.
He's not, but he's actually seeing something. So I'm thinking the release schedule got in front of the QA testing and the monitoring of those various services, those APIs that power these hosts.
Right. And so then stuff starts going a little crazy. So these updates were pushed into production without coordinating with the other various teams.
Well, hold on a second here. Are you saying that APIs could actually be impactful to real people? Like it's just not all about video games and e-commerce stores? Like there could be danger involved if the API is not working.
Oh, absolutely. There are plenty of real life examples, not necessarily just a Westworld example, of when that would be very, very critical, especially if you're using like automated technology like on your body or things like that. But yeah, not great. But yeah, so these updates were pushed into production without real coordination between the teams. So when the host started acting out of their storyline or like straying away from what their intended code should have been producing, their ops team had a really hard time trying to figure out what is going on. So obviously they spent like days. Honestly, I don't even think that they really figured it out all that fast. So mean time to resolution here is not great. But they had a huge problem because they didn't know what was going on. They didn't have the context or understanding of when releases went out and what was going on and how to fix that problem and who to go back to talk to about it. And then ultimately, bad things happen, right? Not the ideal scenario. And so to loop that back in a little bit, what we wanted to talk about in this sort of comparison was that if Delos hadn't basically adopted this idea that if you can increase your observability between testing and monitoring, your release processes and the outputs that you put into production would be of high quality, and then you'd be able to take that product back when something does go wrong and quickly identify the problem, and then use that information to help reproduce the problem and make sure that when you're trying to fix it, that process goes smoothly as well. So we kept this quote up here just to highlight really the power of what happens when you don't coordinate. It's like the only thing that's stopping the host from hacking us to pieces is one line of your code. And if you can't find that one line and you have no idea where to look, it's not going to be a good time for you. So yes, so moving right along, one of the key things we also want to talk about is can you do this with SmartBear Tools? Is this something that's available to you if you're a SmartBear customer? And if you're not, anyway, if you want to do a trial or you want to see if it's something that's possible to do. And our answer is absolutely yes. So I know that a couple of you are actually SmartBear customers, but just to give a quick overview of what SmartBear does and the types of products that we have in our portfolio. We have a variety of different products going from UI to the API layer. So I know we're not talking about UI, but just real quick, you can review your code, test in automated UI, or create automated UI tests in your IDE. And then you can also use a product called Test Complete. So it's functional testing for web, desktop, and mobile. And then cross-browser testing also helps you run those devices on, or run those tests on real devices to test obviously how you perform on different browsers. And then load complete, web load tests, and then I'll go back to alerts because we're going to talk about that a bit today. So from the API side of things, obviously, I'm sure that you guys are familiar or might be familiar with Swagger specification or the Open API specification. So we have tools that support that as well. So one of those would be Swagger Hub, so you can design, develop, and document your APIs. And then you can go through to SOAP UI Pro, where you can actually create automated API functional tests, which we'll talk about today. We'll go into a little bit more detail. And then from that, we have a Ready API platform where basically you can virtualize your APIs and you can load test them as well. And then from there, the main thing that we're going to be talking about today is how to integrate your monitoring processes with your testing processes and what that would look like in terms of tool sets. And then also in terms of like, what are some ways that you can get your teammates to collaborate and make it easy. So testing and monitoring, SOAP UI and alert sites. That's what we're going to be talking about today. We already kind of went over that a little bit, but what you're seeing now is the Ready API interface, which I'll hand it off to John, and we'll kind of explain how API testing and monitoring work together and how you can go from one to the other to get information and then really use the information that you get to amplify that feedback and make sure that you're understanding what's happening in production, how you can fix it, and then push out new updates and releases successfully. So John and Dennis, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, fantastic.
Let's see.
So let's go grab our web conferencing. If you just see sharing.
Yep.
Okay. All right, so we're looking at one of the SmartBear tools called SOAP UI, also known as Ready API. This is the #1 tool for functional testing of RESTful or SOAP-based services, allowing someone who's not necessarily a developer to quickly come in here and build some tests to reflect how that test would be consumed. Make those RESTful tests against those endpoints and build some rules against that payload being returned. So I thought it'd be interesting to make an API test against a Park API. As you can see right here, we have our Park API. And then there's a term they like to use in Westworld called Reverie.
So that malicious update there that was sneakily pushed into production that really caused stuff to hit the fan. What was that called?
Well, it's kind of interesting though, because when it comes to the don't look like anything to me functional test, we have the request for the token because it has to be secure. And then once we get the token back, we resend it and we send it along with the image file. So as Dolores and her father look at the image, what we're going to do is we're going to expect it to reject it and say, it doesn't look like anything to me, but we'll test it or monitor it by sending up the wrong image, maybe an image of the Empire State Building, and should come back as, doesn't look like anything to me. But one thing what's kind of interesting is there is something else that should have stopped the host from rebelling, and that's that command, cease all motive functions. I'm getting this feeling they weren't monitoring that particular call. So I built that one as well, just to be safe. And I have it here requesting the token, and then eventually once it has that token, freeze motor functions. So once you have these tests that you built out within SOAP UI, how do you actually have AlertSite consume them? Well, there's a couple different ways. The easiest way is use the plugin for monitoring APIs built right into Ready API. You could jump in your account like I will here. Once you make that other API connection, you can just grab these monitors with our wizard, Park API, we know our test suite name, and then we're going to do seize all motor functions. You give it a name, or you replace them with an existing monitor that's already in the system, assuming you make an update. Choose the frequency. I generally would recommend getting very aggressive with this particular one, possibly even every minute.
A lot can happen in an hour, right, John?
Yeah, a lot of damage can happen in an hour if this is not working. And then you just click add and upload it.
So John, quick question.
Sure.
Just to be, so people are clear about the kind of the hierarchy of things here. So you're creating in this project a bunch of test cases, right? And each test case could be multiple steps, right?
That's correct, because a lot of times there's a journey an API goes through where you string together multiple requests. In my example, I'm just requesting a token. It could be a key, it could be your certificate being sent back, but it's a combination of requests to interact with the API to get the eventual result you're expecting.
Right, and then that second step, the send image file, reuses that token. And
That's
then
right.
It's making sure that the image or is there or is not there, right? Depending on what you care.
Well, in this case, I would attach the image in the payload.
Yep.
And that image would be validated as something the host should not see, and then send back, doesn't look like anything to me. And that would mean the API is functioning as expected.
Got it. Okay. And then all those components are what goes up to AlertSite.
Correct. But I want to point something out here in regard to a best practice. So I have two different functions here, or two different API calls. One doesn't look like anything to me. Another one, seize all motor functions. You're not uploading these as a group. What you're doing is you'll upload them individually, because there really are two different flows. I just happen to build them in the same test suite and project.
And so from a tool perspective, what we're doing right now really makes it seamless and easy for your test teams to share their projects or their files, the tests that they have, with their operations team. And I'm not sure, it's different in every organization, obviously, about like how far sort of your responsibilities go in terms of like whether you would be responsible for creating those tests or not. But it just makes it really easy for your teams to collaborate without adding unnecessary friction into the process. So let's say that you, obviously in this case, one that we're talking about where it's seize all motor functions is a critical, business critical API that you need to know, not necessarily whether it's even just up or down, but also whether or not it's functioning properly. Because if it's not, you're going to have a huge problem, which obviously that could happen in this scenario for sure. And so the ability to get and share insights in that way can be super, super valuable to teams trying to understand or get visibility into their API layer. So what's really happening sort of behind the scenes and with every single call that you run through.
So this is actually a kind of interesting question that was just posed to us in the chat here. And that question speaks to, not all my team members actually have a copy of SOAP UI. So while we do use SOAP UI within our organization, I, as the AlertSite user, don't have a copy of SOAP UI. So how do I upload these test cases? So I would agree. If you don't have a copy of SOAP UI, you can't use this wizard, and there may not be a good expectation to have them upload it themselves. So what you could do is you can the developer or tester in the project, just right-click on the project name, and then they could export this project. And when you export the project, you'll give it a name, you'll save it.
You can't see that.
Here we go. And then you'll save that zip file, and that zip file will be basically, you're going to take advantage of the sneaker net over the corporate share drive. and then you're going to upload it within the alert site console itself manually. Rather than using the built-in wizard, you're going to use the other way of uploading the test case manually by taking the zip file and uploading it. And I'll show you that functionality right now.
And this example with the crazy killer robots, right, is actually a really good one. We probably should have done this earlier in the year when we talked about the 200 not okay kind of stuff, right, where the API just being generally available but not functioning correctly can be kind of a vague concept. In this context, I think it's pretty clear what the ramifications are if it's not functionally correct.
Oh, right? To that point, what do you think? You think Dolores should be sending back 200 okay for the seize mode of function test if it's not functionally correct? If you're not testing for function, yeah, she'd be like, yeah, 200 okay, right?
Sure, yeah.
Everything going good here, right? Because you're not functionally testing it, looking for the right payload. So let me jump into the alert site console here. So I've actually already uploaded that. And that test here doesn't look like anything to me. And in that test case, I've been running it for a little while here. And you can see it running from Birmingham, Fort Lauderdale, or other parks out there in Dallas, Texas, and Houston. And then here are the two calls: request a token, and then we send our image file and we functionally test the return body looking for that phrase that the host is then supposed to speak. But I spoke to also how do you upload this test case if you just have the zip file. So what you do is, let me just close this out here.
John, by the way, in this case, green means good.
Green is definitely good.
The robots,
if it goes red, that means you may want to give a lot of space between you and the robot.
The robots are doing what they're supposed to do at this point. Okay.
Yes, you should get on that robotic horse and get out of there. So you go to add new monitor, upload monitor, and that's that test case that you saved a little earlier on the zip file format, and then configure from there with those two critical dimensions: time and location. But what happens if you don't have SOAP UI? What happens if you want to build something from scratch? Dennis, you want to give us some insight how that would work?
Yeah, so we recently expanded our ability to monitor APIs directly, or create API monitors directly from the UI.
Go on, Dennis.
John's going to drive. This is going to be fun. Okay, so we showed you that if you clicked over on the upload button, you can take your SOAP UI project test case and upload it directly in. But if you want to create and I'm just going to copy a little text here to make this a little easier when I get to the next screen. You can click over on API Endpoint Monitor and actually create a monitor directly from the alert site console.
So not using SOAP UI at all then?
Correct.
Fantastic.
There may be some things on the back end we're doing with SOAP UI and playback, but the UI itself is native to alert site. You don't have to have any awareness of SOAP UI. You don't have to be using it in your organization. So the SOAP UI reuse story is great if you're using SOAP UI. For those folks who don't use SOAP UI, we have another option here. So we're going to do an example here where we're going to make a call and we're going to get back a unique identifier. That's what that UUID kind of stands for. So we're going to make a get call. We're going to click go here, and we're getting back this UUID value. So similar to the token that John talked about in his SOAP UI example, this would be the equivalent. We're making a call, we're getting back a token. Now we can do a couple of things with this. We can determine that this response is valid by creating an assertion. So by clicking on this, I can do a Json assertion, and I can either say I want this value to be, the same as this one every time, which would be good in some cases. In other cases, this one, for example, it would be bad because it changes every time you make a call. But we can also change this. And I can't see that.
So what we want to do is the one right there.
There we go. Okay. So now what we want to do here is say when we make this call, we want to make sure that this value exists. We know we made the call to get the UID and we got it back. Now we can go further and say, I want to go ahead and make a variable on this UUID to use in a subsequent step. So this would be the equivalent in John's second step in his test case of using that token in the second step to get the picture and return that back. Now I don't have access to that particular API that John did
Well,
working in the park. So we're going to do this off a regular publicly available API instead. So now I've created the variable, and that's all well and good. But now the next piece to this process is creating a multi-step API.
So we're going to chain another step.
That is correct, John. Essentially, something you can only do kind of in SOAP UI. Previously, you can now do here. So now you see we're on step 2. You can see step 1, the call that's made, and you can see that we've also created a variable in step 1. So I'm going to go ahead and remember this one because maybe.
Why you just quit?
All right. John's desktop is not my desktop, so I'm going to let him do that. There we go. That looks like what I was going to type. That's awesome.
That's a different endpoint. But I noticed something on this one. This is a post method.
That's
Do we
correct.
support post?
We do, John. We support a couple of different request methods, which you can see here in the dropdown. So we're going to change this to a post. And what we're doing here is we're going to send that previous value in the body. Now I got to go back to John's. I'm going to go tab. All right. And we're going to put in.
So let's do this.
John's going to do this because
let's roll. Let me go back to.
I do this much better from my machine directly.
Dennis typically doesn't use a mouse.
No, that's
He's
true.
more of a trackball guy. All right, so let's drop this right in here. Now we're going to change. We already have the post, and then we're going to go to the body, and this is where we want to share our. Let me grab this here. Oh, let's validate the first step. Hold on a second. All right. There we go. So you see this icon right here, this arrow. This is going to populate the variable back into the body. Right? This is the payload we're posting back to this endpoint right here. There we go. That's that UUID. That's that token. And we can go to the top again, and let's kind of talk this through. We're going to make a request to this endpoint, get back our UUID, and then on the second request, what we're going to do is we're going to send in the body the UUID. So let's see this thing work in practice. Let me go. Just double check one more thing. All right, let's fire it off. Look at that. We got back our information. Now, how do I know it's functionally correct? Well, we do that by validating some of the information, like one of the JSON nodes. We could take a look at user agent string. And rather than variables, we're going to change it to assertions. Just by clicking down on line 12, I'm going to make a statement saying, I want to look at the JSON node headers.userAgent, and that does it equal this payload, right? Java 1.8 _ 111, etc. That is functional correctness. That would be the equivalent of looking for the payload in the JSON node. What do I see? Doesn't look like anything to me. And then you could just take this test rather than adding another step, which you can, because we're not limiting you to 2 steps. We can go 3, 4, or 5,
keep going.
right? And then we could just go to build that monitor. So now it's all about 2 dimensions, time and location. When is it going to run? And we spoke about, we may want to monitor one of these more aggressively, possibly 1 minute. And monitor from a pool of locations that are available to you. Well, let me change this here. And let's say hypothetically.
Ooh, I have a good one.
Oh, a good question coming in?
No, just a good idea.
Oh,
Do you
all right.
remember? So for those of you that are familiar with Westworld, they have these, the park has been around for a really long time. So they have these like hidden setup QA centers. And so some of them have housed basically really important information. And so as a key location that is remote, since the park is enormous and not easy to traipse through, every 5 minutes or whatever. So what if I had a location like that was super remote, but also very, very important to the functionality and performance of the rest of the park? What would you do?
Sure, there's a couple things you could do. So if you look across the city names here, you'll see places like Beijing, right? Some believe that may not be that far from the park, or places that would be much further, like Atlanta. But if you want to embed a location in one of these special testing labs, you would have to basically take one of these cities and redeploy it. And we do that by supporting Hyper-V, VMware, or even AMI. And I've deployed some here, Asgard, Krypton, and Valhalla. But I have another use case for you. What happens if we want to monitor one of the hosts directly? I mean, they are artificial beings. They really don't have the authority to say no. So what about if we embed our software in them? How do we do that? Well, we would do that with something called an Endpoint Monitor. And we've already done that. We've deployed one right here to Dolores.
What's that? Dolores.
Dolores. So we can now push our monitoring software to Dolores, that host walking around, and we can monitor from her perspective.
Now to be clear,
yes,
we can monitor, you know, we can put our private, you know, endpoint on a Windows Mac, or Linux computer. Now, I don't know what operating system these robots run, so I don't want to make any claims that it's going to work on a robot out of the box.
I understand.
You may want to talk to us if you have a non-standard computer that you want to put one of these on.
Right, definitely Windows-based machines.
I don't want to oversell. That's all.
But so it's super flexible, pretty
Yes.
easy to use and deploy.
But it, you know, in all seriousness, it could be based on, you know, a data center you have. It could be a remote location. It could even be, you know, kind of a home office, a single laptop in your organization. Wherever it is that you need to run that monitor from, we can kind of extend our monitoring network to get there.
Like I have one here, the Somerville PC. This is just a laptop on the floor within our organization. So you could run these tests from those locations back to those endpoints. Yep. In this case here, APIs, or possibly web, if that's what you're trying to do.
And so in this case, let's say like you wanted to know how multiple places in the park were doing. So you would be able to take an endpoint, and if there's a host or a location that's, you know, sort of chained to that area, you would be able to understand how your APIs are performing and what they're doing in those locations. Absolutely. As long as there's Wi-Fi or internet connectivity, absolutely. Oh, this is Delos. They definitely have Wi-Fi. Yeah. I mean, they can build the special elevators. They have Wi-Fi throughout the park. Awesome. Very cool. And of course, upon the failure of these APIs, it's not about that dashboard, which by the way, our dashboard, I've used myself on my own Surface tablet, would display just fine. It's also about that notification engine. Notification engine being the trigger and then the form of communication, that email notification, Slack notification, JSON post if you want to update some other system out there, or text message if you have your cell phone out there on the planes. Right. And so in this case, for observability specifically, this is something that's super helpful. So you have the ability to tailor who you want the alert to go to and what teams you want them to go to, right? That's right. So a QA team may only focus on a subset of monitors, where the operations team may focus on all the monitors, and you could build out these various teams. The nice thing is the teams could overlap, and you basically, each team would represent people or a system, and you're going to embed yourself into these teams and subscribe to the various monitors and their various steps, and the teams could overlap. So you could be in multiple teams, the monitors could be in multiple teams, as well as customizable templates. Generally, they're used in two cases. For email, you want the email to be more reflective of your company culture, or simply what you want to communicate with various variables we present to you in certain orders, or you would integrate with a tool out there, and then you would post JSON to that tool, and they're expecting JSON, certain JSON nodes, and you would have to adjust the template to allow for that. And so this brings up kind of a good point as well, is that one of the key elements in terms of monitoring and testing together and really having insight into what's going on and knowing how to respond when things go wrong, is really having that contextual sort of insight. So when you get an alert, you are able to get the step level detail of like what's going on and why it failed. And then from there, you can go back, especially if you have SOAP UI, which is what we kind of alluded to earlier. If you're using SOAP UI and you created those tests and you're able to identify where within that test case something went wrong in production, you can go back and then reproduce the problem quickly and easily. And so it gives not only does it give sort of like a third party validation for your teams to not argue about whether or not there is an actual problem sort of scenario, but it helps you trace your steps and go back and understand, okay, if I know that this is a step that it failed at, how can I go back and fix that and make it better? And who do I need to talk to do that? So the alerts kind of simplify that process.
Sure. So
there's 2 points to the alerting. You can target the alert not just for the monitor, but the step. So if a particular team is more relevant for the first step, let's say the authentication step, all failures for the first step could go to one team. Failures for subsequent steps could go to a different team. Excuse me. The other way that we can tailor it is by the error codes. So if you've got network failures, they might go to one team. Application failures may go to another. So there's a lot of ways to customize who gets what depending on what fails. So it's as you've got bigger, more diverse groups of folks that address the different components of your applications, we can really target where those alerts go depending on what happens.
Sure. Now, I thought this was inevitable. It looks like there are a few Westworld fans out there, because here's another question. In those scenes where they say seize all mode of functions, what happens if the API does work, but it's really slow? So you say seize all mode of functions, and the response doesn't come back for 5-6 seconds. But at that time, you're in real trouble, right? So is there a way in the system to basically test for performance, even if it is functionally correct? Dennis, I'm going to have you answer that.
Thanks, John. So yeah, we can set up alerts for failures. We can set performance alerts, and they can be based on either dynamic or static thresholds for any monitor in the system. We also have the ability to set specific timeout values within the monitors, which can trigger essentially a failure, but within a prescribed amount of time. And on the SOAP UI side, there's additional response time SLA values that can actually be baked right into the test case itself. So there's a bunch of places in the system where performance can become a critical factor whether the monitor's deemed to be successful or not. So lots of dials and lots of ways to alert on performance degradations in addition to hard failures.
Sure. So in this case here, if I set a roll of half a second using a static roll, what would we put in the alert node given seize all mode of functions seems like pretty critical. What would we want to communicate to the operations team if this particular one is slow?
Well, that there could be massively bad impact to our customers.
Guests in trouble.
Emergency.
We are not able to
lock the doors.
We're not able to take this robot down in a timely manner. So there may be a lag before the commands kick in, and that could be definitely troublesome.
Fantastic, Dennis.
Or lock the doors. That could be another way to go in that note. Yes.
If you're caught up on the episodes, you would realize why that's not helpful.
No, I have not watched the show, so I'm a little bit a little behind the curve on this webinar, but I get the concepts. The concepts are universal, by the way.
It's a show, it's a movie, there's so many options. Old school movie.
I did see the old movie, so I see how this works.
Hence the same way.
They probably didn't have APIs back then, did they?
It's just slower delivery, code, yeah.
Fortran or something,
it's like,
right?
Yeah, Fortran delivered over like radio waves.
Yep.
All right.
So what sort of information can we go back to the dashboard real quick?
Yeah, sure.
And look at what sort of information you can get when you're in the platform as well.
Sure. So it really comes down to the two fundamental questions. Is the application availably and functionally correct? Right? We kind of lump that in together if the author of the monitor did what they're supposed to do. And that's represented by the status, right? Green is always good. And then we just reinforce that with the check mark. If it's not performing to our expectation, we're going to get a failure code. And of course, it's going to turn red to draw your eye to it. And then, assuming we're not setting up performance alerts, we have our Spark line. And if we look at this card game one, we could see the erratic performance of our card game. This is not what we want to see. We want to see some consistency from that API being returned. We see the performance of it over time, availability. Then also some other key indicators and traits about this monitor is this monitor actually has a blackout window. A blackout window is reoccurring. What happens if the hosts have to be brought in for 2 hours every night? I recall them bringing a lot of them in for repair jobs. So you may want to turn off the monitoring for a certain period of time. So this indicator, the arrow swinging there in the circle, is letting you know that the monitor can go into a maintenance window at some point. The frequency of the monitor, how often does this monitor run? Every 30 minutes. And then the bell indicates that this monitor has elected to receive notifications, and which will trigger notifications. So there'll be some situations where you're playing around with the monitor, just testing it out. And if the bell's not there, that indicates to you that this monitor will never set an alert if it fails. And the last thing is here is a piece of paper. This is a little note allowing you to share information, domain knowledge of the team members that are looking at the dashboard that aren't necessarily sitting next to you.
Awesome.
But what happens if you want to see the performance and availability from different locations? We could do that. So we could pop that out right here with our little map pin. Then you can see I'm monitoring from Calgary, one of our newer nodes, Memphis and Seattle. Right, we're going to choose a pool of locations that reflect where your users sit. And why don't we take a look at it? It doesn't look like anything to me. We see a group of locations all the way out there in Austin, Texas. And we also could see it by step by popping those out right here. And then you could also drill into the individual runs themselves. And I think I alluded to this earlier. By clicking through one of the hourly segments, we're just looking back at 24 hours. Let me jump in. Here we go. Then we see a request my token, send image file, and then you can see the performance of that particular API call as it looks back at its historical average of the last 7 days and as it moves away from the baseline. Now, this monitor's only been running for a short amount of time, so there's not a lot of data to work on, and it's relatively fast. Fortunately, it's very relatively fast in this case here.
Yeah, those baselines, they may take the first day to start to populate. So you pick the brand new one on that one. So.
That's right.
So what if, let's say that something does go wrong and we've set it up so that when a certain error occurs, it goes to a select part of the test team, and they're working on it and trying to reproduce the problem and then trying to test it to make sure it's okay. How would I, as a test person who, if let's say I don't have an alert site account or I don't have access to the dashboard to check on how this is going, is there a way that you can share that information with the other members of your team simply without having to?
There is. So if you don't want to go for the effort or expose the account,
screenshots,
right? Printer. So you could just create. Let me just close out our quick panel here. You can create a share link by going to our gear icon. And the share link will allow you to get access to this particular tile without having to authenticate. So we're going to bring up our share link. This does auto refresh, by the way. So we could, if this turns red, I wouldn't say panic necessarily. Maybe consider the slowly back away from your chair and make your way towards the summit for the helicopter extract.
Exit silently.
And just so folks understand, that's our alternate view. That's the tile view. The dashboard has two modes, a tile and a list view. The shareable link takes you to the tile. So multiple tiles can be embedded in different screens and dashboards that you might build on your side.
All right, if you want to switch the whole interface to the tile view, you could just flip that over by clicking on right to our little tiles right here. And then it'll resort everything into the tile view. So if you don't have a lot of monitors, the tile view may be easier on the eyes. If you have a lot of monitors, maybe the listing view works for you, but it's something you could toggle on and off.
And also, Dennis and John, we have a question. So do we have a multi-tenancy model that different teams can set up their own monitoring without having access to other teams' setup?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways of going about that. So one, you certainly could build in filters or views, and these filters or views would allow you to just basically isolate monitors to the monitors that you care about, like I've done here. But really, to the spirit of the question, is you really want to isolate these monitors in different silos so you don't have access to it. I would go about it a different way. And I would do that with sub-accounts. So what you create is a parent sub-account structure, and you just give them access to multiple, an individual sub-account. Maybe you have 8 sub-accounts, and if you have access to the sub-account, you can't navigate outside your sub-account. For all you know, that's your only world that you know. And if you're in the parent, right up there in that summit, you can go down to all the individual worlds or sub-accounts.
And
Awesome.
one note on kind of future functionality, we're looking at introducing kind of a more granular permissions model within a single account, where certain groups of users would have access to certain monitors or groups of monitors, and you'd have various privileges associated with those, whether it be view only or view and edit or delete. So while the sub account approach accomplishes that kind of ability to segment monitors by teams, we are looking at some additional ways to do that within a single account. That should be something we'll probably going to do second half of this year, but we'll see where the exact timeline falls over time.
And we do currently have user permissions too, so it's not like you go in and everything's.
That's right. You have
wide
read-only,
open.
you have co-admin, power users, so we can lock people down from breaking things. Maybe that wasn't their intent. People are just trying to look at their data,
Yeah.
but you don't want them changing things
Just
necessarily.
accidentally,
Yeah, what does this button do?
things happen.
Things do happen. Yes.
Alrighty, so I'm gonna steal the screen back from you guys if that's
Okay.
okay. For now, we can.
Oh, so let me stop my
I
share.
got it. All right. Oh, so also another thing, if you guys are just curious why this one's black, in the screenshot here, there is also night mode. So this is the same screen that we were looking at, obviously a different set of monitors, but if that's easier for you to see, which it is for me, I know Dennis likes it too. So that's an option as well.
I'm a night mode fan.
Just a personal preference. But moral of the story, and most importantly, how can you really cultivate a culture that supports observability? And how can you make sure that these teams are working together? And really, it's about adopting a different mindset so that you prioritize maintaining and delivering quality applications. And so broke it down into 3 most important rules. The first one being, think about the output, right? So obviously, this is something that you think about because you're embedded in designing these new APIs or new applications. But really think about how, this is kind of in tune with BDD as well, is like, think about how a person is going to interact with this system. What are the things that are going to be important to them? And so, for example, in Westworld, they did a pretty good job, obviously, of like designing it and making it look pretty. But once they sort of went into this, I guess, agile process, right? Like plugging that back in. But when they move too quickly and they don't collaborate with one another and push code into production without really doing their due diligence with that, things can go wrong. And even if they did, let's say that they tested it repeatedly, things perform different sort of in the wild than they do in your test environments. There are always unexpected factors that kind of come into play and mess up your initial plan. So make sure that you're building systems that are monitorable, so that when it does come to be time to monitor them, you can, and you can get actionable, useful, contextual information so that you can go back and reproduce the problems.
And one note on this, monitoring is not just for production.
Yes.
And we're seeing, a lot more of our customers are starting to kind of shift left on the monitoring, and starting to at least looking at their staging environments, making sure, number one, that they're baselining the code before it goes live from sort of a performance standpoint, but you're also validating that the monitors are still working. And you don't break the monitors when you roll out a new version of an API or an application.
Absolutely. So then the next part, building off of that, is really learning to collaborate and communicate within your team. So whether collaboratively you're testing and monitoring alongside one another, because they really are complementary, or if it's whether you're still testing and you're monitoring in production, but you have the ability to work together to be able to fix and reproduce problems quickly. And so a key part of that really is understanding what's going wrong, and then having the proper monitoring data to send back and say like, hey, this is the step where an error occurred. This is what's happening. We really need to figure out what's going on and try and fix this problem ASAP. Especially in this case, on the side, you can see their head of QA saying that she's definitely not going to sign off on deploying that code. So it's super important. And then the third and final thing that I would add is to make sure that you find the tools that can support your goals. Obviously in the show, they have a bunch of really, really cool tech that gives them almost full insight into what's going on. I would say not enough when things do go wrong. Sure, they know sort of where in the park it's happening, but they seem to be a little bit frazzled on reproducing and fixing the problem. So make sure that you're finding tools that can fit into your workflows. They give you informative insights, whether that's being able to reuse tests or integrate systems. Just make sure that you're able to have that sort of insight there.
They might have focused a little too much on the UI of their dashboards.
Yeah.
And not so much on the value of the data underneath it.
Right. And so really the whole point of this before we wrap up, I know we have a couple minutes left, is just the whole goal with observability is really to minimize I heard this quote from an article that I read that I thought was really great. It was minimize the number of unknown unknowns. And so testing and monitoring in conjunction with one another helps you narrow that down as much as you possibly can. So it's super important, especially for API monitoring, which I feel like, we've talked about this is a bit in the early adopter stage. It's a bit nascent at the moment, but people are starting to catch on and realize that there are tools that can help you understand not only whether or not your API is available, but what's actually going on. What is the health of your API, especially your API layer, if it's something that's business critical and something that even if you have an application that relies on that, it's super important. And so having a monitoring tool and a testing sort of tool, or just even those teams being collaborative and having a goal set to monitor as much as you can without fatiguing yourself with alerts is key there. And so understand what's happening, actually, not just whether or not you're available or not. So I'll open up the floor to questions. I know we had a couple come in already. So there's a function, I know a bunch of people have found it, but I'll say it for people who aren't sure. There's a function in here in Zoom where you can ask a question via the Q&A, and we see all of those, so we can raise those as well. And if not, let me see what's going on here. All right. I also have a couple questions for you guys if you want to see them. So real quick, just stir the pot. I'll ask you guys a couple questions. So they're just simple. You just pick one answer for the most part. I think there's one that has
I thought you were going to ask us questions.
I know, I was bracing. What's happening?
Oh, no, sorry. Us
focused.
As in, I'm going to ask you as in participants. So if you would like to, just feel free to answer any of the questions. They're not super personal or scary, I promise. Mainly just for understanding what's going on with you guys. So whether or not you guys monitor your APIs currently, or if you're struggling with that.
So are you testing for fidelity right now?
Testing for fidelity. For those of you that don't watch Westworld, you definitely should. It's a very, very interesting show, but in this case happened to work out to be a little bit fun of an example, a little bit more concrete. So let's see. Getting some results in now. Nice. So a couple of you said that you have private or not publicly facing APIs. So we kind of touched upon that earlier as well. I think a lot of people struggle with trying to identify a tool where you can monitor your APIs behind your firewall without.
Most APIs are private, right? Is that still the case, Joe? I know.
They believe there was a study at one point said it was something close to 90% of the APIs out there are internal facing. But let me define what internal versus external means, because I think people get tied around the axle with this particular definition when they really don't kind of peel it back for a bit. It doesn't really mean behind the firewall. I don't think it was ever meant that. What it really means is public versus internally consumed. Like for an example, an API that powers the Facebook application, that's between Facebook and itself, right? Between the app and their data centers. It's not externally facing. So 10% of the APIs out there are meant to be consumed by people, not necessarily like us, but other app developers possibly, right? Maybe you have to pay a license, but it's meant to be consumed by non-internal customers.
Right. And that's why we had 3 and 4 as 2 different questions here.
Right.
Yeah, makes sense. All righty. So I think we may have answered the majority of the questions as we went along, or hopefully we were just very comprehensive.
Probably that, yeah.
Yeah. So if there are no more questions, or if you guys, I'll give you some time if you want to fill out the poll, feel free. But if you don't want to, that's okay too. So if there are no more questions, then I will give you guys back the last 2 minutes of your day. Thanks so much for joining us. Hopefully this is helpful. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to reach out to any of us. You can tweet at us too. I included that in there, but my email should be in your invite, your email invite, and look out for one from me because I'll send you guys the recording of this if you feel like it was useful and you want to share it with someone, or you just know someone that really likes Westworld and tech, and maybe they will find that storyline as interesting as we did. But otherwise, have a great rest of the day, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.